Well, over the years, there has been billions upon billions of dollars spent in places like the Northern Territory that face a youth crime crisis and entrenched Indigenous disadvantage. Yesterday on this program, I spoke to Marion Scrimgeour. She is an incredible leader, really, in the Northern Territory, and she speaks common sense. Yesterday, she told us here on AM Agenda that she's been speaking to the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and the Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney about actually changing the law to make sure that this money that goes to all these contractors in places like the Northern Territory actually have a greater level of accountability. There are questions when, $250 million spent and announced by Anthony Albanese just in the last year, but the impact on the ground doesn't seem to be making that big a difference. So there is a gap here. This is what Marion had to say.
An audit is one thing, and how long does that audit take? I think what we need to do is, change what I see as the PGPA Act, which is about performance, governance and accountability. Now, land councils come under that, but I think that anyone who gets Commonwealth funding, and you could do it specifically for the Northern Territory so that we can try and start getting the outcomes that we want in terms of performance, better governance in terms of organisations. We've got a number of key organisations in Central Australia and the Barkly that are in administration. They play, and that has a huge impact on those communities and what can happen. So I've written to both Linda Burney and also Mark Dreyfus to look at putting and tweaking the PGPA Act to get greater accountability for all organisations, not just land councils, but all organisations.
So it makes sense, doesn't it? And it's incredible that it's taking Marion to put it on the table now. So is there support for this? Actually more accountability? Seeing where the money goes? Asking contractors to actually tell taxpayers how that money is making a difference? Joining me live now is a Shadow Minister for Child Protection and Prevention of Family Violence, Karen Liddle. Karen, thanks so much for your time. So we heard there from Marion.
Good morning.
She's kind of backed the audit, which is your side of politics idea here. She says, yes, great, have an audit. But she's gone a little bit further than that. She's talked about accountability and actually changing the Act. Is that a good idea?
Well, it's interesting to hear her singing from the song sheet that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and I have been talking about since we came into Parliament 2 years ago. Look, we hear Marion talking about these things. We've heard her talk about these things before, but clearly the Prime Minister, who said all last year and the year before that he was listening, is not listening to his local member, and he certainly doesn't listen to us in our calls for this. We've heard a kaleidoscope of commentary about what's happening in Central Australia. I go back to, you only have to look at the impact of domestic and family violence in all its forms. You only have to look at the impact of alcohol consumption. And let's remember, in the Northern Territory, alcohol is an issue for the entire Northern Territory in that alcohol consumption per capita is 4 times the national average. So this is not just a problem for Indigenous people or people in Alice Springs. This is a problem for the entire territory. And so we have to get a grip, because what's happening there is kids are not in school, and you don't have to go very far to find the evidence when you're actually interested in looking, as opposed to the Prime Minister who's monitoring the situation. The recent issue that plastered these images, dreadful images across our screens, came from communities to the northeast of Alice Springs. Now, in those communities, there are 2 schools very close to each other. In those schools, the attendance rate at those schools is 34% for one of them and in the 20s for the other. So we have a situation where we have children not going to school. When I went to Alice, I saw more children in the courtroom than I think are in those classrooms.
Can we go back a step though? And yes, I hear what you're saying when it comes to alcohol consumption, but I think what Marion's talking about is actually making sure that all of these organisations who are given these hundreds of millions of dollars every year actually have to, under law, show how the money is being spent and how it is actually working. As a first principle, it should be happening now, shouldn't it?
Well, it's one of the questions I've been asking, certainly in the Senate for some time, in that those same organisations, the leadership of those organisations, when those alcohol restrictions were lifted, let's remember there was a lot of commentary from the Congress to not lift. They were begging not to lift those alcohol restrictions and to continue those restrictions. Then they begged for some time for them to be reinstated. And I noticed they're actually talking about reintroducing punitive measures now. So I'm hoping that the Prime Minister is listening to them, because he certainly hasn't been listening to us. While we talk about those people those alcohol restrictions being lifted, I remember watching people very publicly from those organisations that have received money from the Commonwealth to help fix this problem that was lit like a bonfire when those alcohol restrictions were lifted. They have actually received money to fix a problem that they were jumping around saying this lifting of the alcohol restrictions is terrific for human rights. And I remember Senator Nampijinpa Price and myself saying, whose human rights are you actually caring about? So it's not just about auditing these in organisations, it's about actually interrogating the fundamental principles on which they're operating. And that must be improving the lives, connecting up and not operating in silos, and stopping those organisations that aren't delivering to maximum effect from getting the funds.
Well, that's right.
You don't need to spend a long time to make those decisions.
Yeah, well, Marion's talking about actually changing the legislation, changing the nature of the Act so that this has to happen. She says she's spoken to Mark Dreyfus with initial conversations, and also Linda Burney about this. If she gets this up, would she enjoy some bipartisan support on it, do you think?
What they could have done was, when they poured nearly 300 million into Central Australia, this is a community of around 35,000 people, what they could have done was said, do you know what, we're not going to give money to organisations that don't already comply with the basic requirements of the regulator. They already should have complied. But you know what, we've seen the Minister, we've seen the Prime Minister give out money to organisations, taxpayers' money, to fix a problem in the Northern Territory without actually asking that fundamental question. So they could do some stuff right now. They could actually say to those organisations, no more funding.
Okay, I understand that.
And we're talking about some 18 months. We're talking about some 18 months later.
Look, I agree. A lot of this is too little, too late.
I don't see the Prime Minister standing next to her.
No, but Marion was on this program yesterday.
I don't see the Prime Minister standing next to her.
No, but let's say that she does convince those in her party that this is a good idea, including the Prime Minister, Dreyfus, Linda Burney. Would there be bipartisan support for it?
There would be bipartisan support to stop giving money to those organisations that aren't meeting their existing obligations right now.
Yeah. Okay.
We've been asking for that for some time. That's an easy solution. That's a quick fix solution.
Yeah.
Not to give money to organisations that haven't submitted annual reports to the public, to the very people that they're supposed to serve, for years. There are some organisations in Central Australia doing some amazing work. We need to give them the money to do more of what they're doing.
In your capacity, when you look at families in your portfolio, I look at Alice Springs, and you know, Darren Clark has talked about, he's been the most positive he's ever been since I've met him almost 2 years ago. He says the curfew's essentially worked. But what I worry about is that, okay, the violence, the antisocial behaviour isn't on the streets, but what's happening behind closed doors?
Well, that's the other question we've been asking. You know, we really do need to get stuck into what's happening with domestic and family violence in all its forms, including sexual abuse in the Northern Territory. We know that the rates are higher. We also know the incarceration rates of people in the prison system is higher, and most of them are there for domestic and family violence related offences. Then you turn to drug and alcohol misuse. You know, we've seen some information this week about whether drug and alcohol intervention programs have been actually established in the Northern Territory, in Central Australia, or not. It's not even clear. The lack of detail from this plan, and yet it seems we can't even get information about how much of that money has actually been spent and allocated. You know, this is a government that doesn't provide a lot of detail. It talks about monitoring a situation, but residents know. I mean, I was born and raised in Alice Springs. I have immediate family members still there. I've got qualifications in governance. I've actually sat in a governing capacity. on some Aboriginal boards. And I can tell you that there are some great organisations and there are some pretty damn terrible ones, and we need to stop funding those ones that are terrible.
Yep.
They're not hard to identify, just like it's not hard to identify those places where the problem is going to come into the future, because the children are not attending school right now. When you actually don't, I hear people talking about the employment of Aboriginal people. That's going to somehow fix this. I've actually been employed to put people into service in the private sector, thousands of people, and I can tell you that unless you have education and can read and write, unless you've got on top of drug and alcohol abuse, and even if it's not you, it's within your family group, it is almost impossible to work, to be focused on personal responsibility and individual responsibility because of this dysfunction that sits around you. So unless this is addressed in a holistic way, and this is not about saying to the Territory Government, here's a heap of money, you go out and decide how to do it. This is Australian taxpayers' money. That's where this money comes from, and they need to be accountable. And the Albanese government needs to be more accountable for checking up on the outcomes, because I haven't been able to get that information through the Senate estimates process to understand exactly what the outcomes are and how this is progressing.
Yeah,
for better outcomes.
I agree. Yeah, it's hard to see where the outcomes, the good outcomes, are from just $250 million being spent in the last year or so. Karen, thanks so much for your time as always.